That the blue coat has been established, I'm ready to start subsequent layers. Mixing the plaster as before, 1 part water, 2 parts plaster. This time I do not use the liquid bluing. I want all white plaster. And shake the plaster in slowly, let it disappear beneath the surface of the water until you build up a little volcano cone or plaster cone. Let it rest for about 5 minutes. It's called slaking. With the plaster ready to flick, it goes on fairly thin. That way it locks into all the little crevices. I'm starting at the top and letting gravity do its work. Again, I'm building up out towards the ends of the shims, concentrating on covering the blue coat. Again, I'm flicking it on with my fingers. Building up that inside edge so that it remains strong. The edge between the model and the flange. Keep flicking it on. With this coat, I really want to get all the blue covered. And I'm taking the plaster from the base, mixing it back in the bowl, recycling it. The more you work the plaster, the thicker it becomes. Again, I'm taking the air hose to it, and this eliminates bubbles and also adds a texture to it so that the subsequent coats will adhere to the plaster. Gravity wants to make it thick in the collar and at the base, and we don't need it all that thick in those places, so I just keep pushing it out of the areas that it likes to group up in, so we don't have to remove a whole bunch of plaster. Okay, I've got a nice flange at the bottom. The plaster's covered the shims all the way, so we've got a nice buildup, knocking off a little bit of those stalactites under the chin. The back of the ear is filled. Now I'm adding the irons. We want vertical supports and horizontal supports. Adding the irons while the plaster is setting up you have an advantage because it will set into the plaster, and then you can use the excess plaster that's left in the bowl to secure the irons onto the mold. I'm getting 3 or 4 central vertical columns, and you want the flange to have reinforcement too, or else the flange will break off when you're trying to remove the mold. I'm using the excess plaster to reinforce or to hold the irons onto the plaster. They'll harden. So as I start to throw the plaster, the irons will want to fall off. Now I'm adding figuring out how to bend the iron for the flange. So we want that flange reinforced very well. Now I have a better shape for that flange, but still I need a little more reinforcement on top of the flange. So I'll add some smaller, shorter pieces on top of the flange. It's easier to just bend another piece of quarter-inch round bar. Is what I'm using for my irons. And while the plaster is still somewhat soft, I'm attaching the rounds with the plaster so it'll stay in shape. The plaster is becoming putty-like now. Now I'm going to be adding my horizontal supports. Adding another horizontal support. You want to get it as close to the plaster as possible so you don't have to build out to the iron. So I'm trying to place these irons as close to the plaster as possible. I did a bottom one for the bottom flange and one in the center, one at the top going across the face. And using some old plaster to secure it, hold it in place. It may be excessive, but I'm putting one down the center just to make sure that the face doesn't pop out. It's not that hard to remove the irons from the mold. Mixing up the plaster, I think I'm mixing up about 3 quarts of water, about 6 quarts of plaster for the final coat. Again, mixing the plaster as I did before. Shaking it in and letting it completely disappear under the surface. Until we have a nice peak. Okay, we've got a nice peak. I'm going to let that sit for about 5 minutes. And I found out that I turned my microphone on this time. Okay, I'm throwing the plaster on as before, getting it well into the irons. We want to get those irons, no air holes, so you want to build up past the into the irons and get them filled completely in back of the irons. That'll give your mold the strength that it needs. Again, I'm using the excess plaster to keep putting it on. I think I'm going to have to have an added coat of plaster on top of this one. The thinness of the plaster makes it difficult to put on. We just have to take care to fill all the voids behind the irons. Pay attention to the bottom of the mold. Keep that clean. And get a nice shape to the mold so that it will retain its strength. I like to build up the plaster to the flanges, get nice clear flanges appearing. Okay, now I'm detaching the shims and I'll be cleaning up the sides of the walls using a saw. This will just make it easier to find where to separate the mold if you have a good edge around the mold. Take your time to put a good edge on your flange. This will make the ease of separating your mold much easier to find your parting line when you have to discover your parting line. Don't neglect to the bottom of the flange. Okay, clean off the bottom of your board and dress the back of your mold. If you see any edges that need to be tapered, go ahead and taper them now. I like to use air to clean off the edges where any plaster may have fallen. In anticipation to separating the mold, I make little clay wedges to put on the back of the mold so that it will be easy to separate. Now I apply green soap, mold separation material, and I also do it to the sides. It's a good idea to apply the mold release agent to the sides of the mold. I also like to add about an inch of mold soap on the front side of the mold next to the seam. As we did on our front, we add liquid bluing to our first coat of water and repeat the same steps that we did to the front side of the mold. With our quantities being 2 plasters to 1 water, add the plaster until it comes to a peak. and let it rest. Gone ahead and splash coated it. Now that it's gotten thicker, I can add texture just with my fingertips. I want to get it locked in good and tight for that second coat. And we're throwing it on. Again, the proportion is 2 plasters to 1 water. Repeating the steps as we did on the front, we add the second coat of plaster and attaching the irons in a similar fashion that we did the front. Irons around the flange, a vertical iron down the center, and horizontal reinforcements as well. Adding the subsequent irons, and again we need to get the horizontal at the base so that doesn't break up. Okay, now it's ready to fill the backside. We want to get those irons well covered with plaster so that they have strength. That's another reason why it's good to put on a thin coat of plaster so that that plaster really adheres to those irons. I like to get all the voids filled behind the irons. While building up the mold walls, it's a good idea to keep in mind the edges of the mold so that you can separate it without any problem. Again, I'm using a Bondo scraper as my spatula. That's a nice finishing tool. And again, paying attention to those registration walls or flanges.